So let's begin this lecture module by briefly recapping the conclusions we came to at the end of the last lecture module. So when we thought about how it was that you would have to implement that separation assumption, what features a case would have to have in order for the separation assumption to work out, we said that you're going to have to be able to come up with a characterization of a process that continues to be reliable, even though it dictates that belief that runs contrary to massive cogent evidence. And we said you'd have to do that in a way that makes it likely that it would even form that belief. And also that it would form that belief in a way that from the person's own subjective perspective, they appeared to be irrational and irresponsible in forming their belief. And so we looked at two different scenarios, two different candidate processes for belief revision, PU and PI. PU was a general belief revision process that just ignored massive amounts of cogent evidence regardless of where the original belief came from. And we said that process just doesn't look very likely to be reliable at all. And so it seems to give up the reliability. We said, well, one way we can guarantee that the process is reliable is if we just tune it to the clairvoyant process, which is perfectly reliable in these examples, so that it just evaluates beliefs that are generated by clairvoyance, and it does so by assigning them such a high evidential merit that even massive amounts of cogent evidence don't undermine them. And so the person continues to believe in them even in the face of this massive evidence. Now we've got a reliable process because it inherits the reliability of clairvoyance. However, from the subjective perspective of the reasoner, the perspective on the evidence seems to change by doing that move with PI. If we're going to assign high evidential merit to the deliverances of clairvoyance, that will be the reasoner's subjective perspective on the evidence. So they will believe the deliverance of the clairvoyant power precisely because that's the thing that has the greatest evidential merit to them. And so from their own subjective perspective, they don't seem like they're behaving irrationally or irresponsibly. We don't have to stretch our imaginations at all to understand how this scenario would work. We just have to look at cases of perception. Perception operates just like this. So if you're sitting at your kitchen table in good light and you put a box down in close proximity and it's not obscured by anything, you form a belief that there's a box in front of me. And if I were to then say, oh, but look at all this counter evidence to that, you would no doubt feel a pretty strong psychological resistance to modifying your belief in light of this evidence given what you're seeing right in front of you. Precisely because your visual system has just naturally accorded this high epistemic merit, so that when you're in good lighting conditions, when an object is close to you and there's nothing that's obscuring or obstructing your view of that object, that deliverance from your visual system has an incredibly high epistemic warrant, such that it would take a lot to override that epistemic warrant. Now, it may not be impossible, but it certainly would be difficult for you to do. And this would be the exact parallel to Sam's circumstances with clairvoyance using PI. And so it doesn't look like BonJour can get that irrationality out of PI, and he can't get the reliability out of PU. So regardless of our judgments about Sam's use of PI, whether we think she'd be irrational or irresponsible from our perspective, I've suggested that she wouldn't be. The crucial test for BonJour's argument really is Sam's perspective on her belief. Does Sam see herself as being irresponsible and irrational in believing P? But here I think PI tells us definitively no. From Sam's own perspective, the counter evidence just has less evidential merit than the fact that she's got this deliverance from her clairvoyant power. And so it doesn't seem like she is irrational or irresponsible from her own subjective perspective. And I think this brings up another troubling aspect of BonJour's cases. Once we start to examine these cases more carefully and be careful about how we think about the process and how we think about the timeline and how we think about the subjective state of the reasoner, we start to realize that BonJour's examples all turn on what's probably a false supposition, but certainly a highly questionable supposition about the relationship between belief and one's subjective perspective on the likelihood of that belief. So for example, in the Maud case, BonJour claims that Maud continues to believe in the reliability of her clairvoyant power, despite what appears from her own subjective perspective to be massive, cogent, scientific evidence against P. So that from her own subjective perspective, BonJour would suggest, she believes she's being irrational and irresponsible in believing in the reliability of her clairvoyant process. But ask yourself, do you really think that's how people's beliefs work? This isn't to say that people don't believe things on the basis of inadequate evidence or no evidence, or even in the face of a lot of counter evidence. But what I've found in my experience is that when people maintain these beliefs, they tend to do so with a story about why it is that their evidence has greater evidential merit than the counter evidence, or why it is that they believe it even though they don't have very much evidence, and so on. It's hard to find people who say, yes, I definitely think this is false, and that's why I believe it. And that's really what BonJour requires of these characters in his various scenarios. Another way that we can think about these implicit claims in BonJour's examples about the relationship between belief and our subjective perspective of the evidence supporting or detracting from that belief is to imagine similar scenarios from our own experiences. So we can imagine cases like PI in our own experience and see if it makes sense to interpret it under the subjective perspective that BonJour suggests or the subjective perspective that I've suggested. So imagine that you're engaging in a visual object recognition task. The object's directly in front of you. It's not occluded. It's not obscured. It's very close to you, and it's in good light. So you think you see it. Let's say it's a box. You think there's a box in front of me. And then I tell you, but I've got a bunch of evidence that there's really not a box. So all you have is this evidence and your visual object recognition system telling you there's a box in front of you. Now you may ultimately decide that you want to revise your belief or withhold your belief. But I think in this situation, if you think about it, you would be very resistant to changing your belief. You're looking straight at this thing in good light, at close distance. There are no obstructions. It's not partially occluded or anything like that. It's just right there in front of you looking really like a box. You'd need some pretty significant evidence to override the output from your visual object recognition system. And I think this is the problem for BonJour. Our visual object recognition system is accorded this very high evidential merit. What we think we see in good lighting at close distance when the objects are not obscured, that's very strong evidence for what we should believe. And it has to be overridden by massive counter evidence. All right? We don't just give up on a belief because someone says, oh, I don't think so. So if I'm standing directly in front of a car and I'm looking right at it, and you walk up to me and you say, oh, you think you see a car, but you don't really see a car. You're suffering from a mass delusional hallucination. It was written about in the latest edition of Scientific American. You would probably find yourself resisting modifying your belief. It's hard to doubt what is very apparent in front of your eyes. Now, you can come to have reasons to reject it, but it isn't easy or obvious. And this is what BonJour wants. BonJour wants you to say, oh, I see this is obviously false, but I believe it anyway. And that doesn't seem to jibe with the scenarios that we can imagine from our own experiences that would be correlates to the cases that BonJour talks about. And so when we start to think about what belief would have to be like on BonJour's scenario, it seems to run afoul of the way that we normally understand belief. So if you accept the truism that one's belief in a proposition entails the belief that the proposition is true, in other words, that you don't believe things that you think are false, then it seems like you're kind of compelled to reject BonJour's cases as psychologically impossible. That is, if you're believing a proposition involves cognitively registering its likely truth, then if one's aware of massive cogent counter evidence that would seem to make it obviously false, it doesn't seem like you would believe it in light of that perception. If you actually believe this isn't true, then it's hard to imagine that you would continue to believe it even though you acknowledge that it wasn't true. So imagine the following scenario. As you're listening to this lecture, right, just try and force yourself now to believe that you're not the person you are, but instead you're George Washington, and you're on the beach in Bora Bora. You've got massive cogent evidence that that's not the case. But somehow you're still able to believe it's the case on BonJour's story. Somehow, even though from your perspective, there's no way that belief is true, you nevertheless believe it. And that just doesn't seem psychologically plausible. It just doesn't seem like we have that kind of unlimited doxaxic voluntarism, where we can believe things even though from our own perspective, they're obviously not true. And we can just choose to believe things. I believe I'm 27 feet tall. I just decide to believe that. And sure, sure, I know I'm not, right? But that doesn't matter. I believe that it is. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so it seems like the way that BonJour wants us to think about these cases involves this notion of belief that really violates our understanding of what it is to believe something to begin with. So as a result, it looks like it's really difficult to generate a reliable belief-forming process that takes all this counter evidence into account and yet is still likely to generate the belief and likely to generate that belief in a way that makes it seem from the person's own subjective perspective that that belief is obviously not true. That's what BonJour's really asking you to suppose is happening. And it gives you no real plausible counterexamples once you start thinking about it more carefully to illustrate this in a real life scenario.